For most of human history, the word civilization has carried an air of certainty. It appears in textbooks, museums, and academic discourse as if its meaning were stable, measurable, and universally agreed upon. Civilizations rise. Civilizations fall. They are mapped, dated, categorized. Yet when examined closely, the term begins to lose its apparent solidity. What seems like a clear label starts to resemble a modern container, carefully built and then placed around a past that did not know it existed. The investigation begins with a simple but disquieting observation. No ancient society ever described itself as a civilization in the sense used today. The word is a retrospective construction, shaped by historians, archaeologists, and philosophers attempting to organize vast stretches of human experience into coherent patterns. It is not an ancient identity but a modern framework. That framework carries assumptions about progress, complexity, and hierarchy that influence how evidence is interpreted before a single artifact is even examined. Traditionally, civilization has been defined through a recognizable checklist. Cities of substantial size. Systems of writing. Centralized government. Social classes. Monumental architecture. Organized religion. These features appear repeatedly in discussions of early societies in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and ancient China. The presence of these elements has often served as a threshold. On one side, prehistoric or tribal cultures, on the other, civilization. The boundary seems clear, almost mathematical. Yet each item on this list raises questions. How large must a settlement be before it becomes a city? Does writing need to represent spoken language, or can symbolic record systems qualify? Must political authority be centralized, or can complex societies function through distributed power? Even the notion of social class is difficult to measure in archaeological remains, inferred from burials, housing patterns, and access to goods. These criteria, while useful, are not as precise as they appear. More significantly, the checklist reflects a particular historical perspective. It privileges visible, durable structures, stone buildings, inscribed tablets, monumental art. Societies that built in wood, used perishable materials, or relied on oral systems of memory leave different traces. Their complexity can be harder to detect, not necessarily because it was absent, but because it was recorded in forms that do not survive as easily in the archaeological record. The risk, acknowledged by many scholars, is that preservation bias may be mistaken for historical reality. Debate emerges most clearly when archaeologists encounter societies that seem to meet some criteria for civilization while lacking others. There are large settlements without clear evidence of kings or centralized palaces. There are elaborate ritual centers predating agriculture. There are extensive trade networks connecting distant regions long before writing appears. Each case complicates the idea of a single developmental ladder. Underlying these debates is a deeper issue, the assumption that civilization represents an evolutionary stage, a step forward from simpler forms of social organization. This view has roots in 19th-century social theory, which arranged human societies along a spectrum from savagery to barbarism to civilization. While such terminology has been abandoned, echoes of the progression model remain. Complexity is often equated with advancement. Urbanization is read as improvement. Yet archaeological evidence does not always support a linear narrative of progress. Some researchers argue that many features associated with civilization, hierarchy, intensive labor systems, dense populations, also introduced new forms of vulnerability. Disease spreads more easily in crowded settlements. Dependence on agriculture ties communities to environmental stability. Social inequality can produce internal tensions. From this perspective, civilization is not simply a milestone of achievement but a trade-off, a reorganization of human life that solved certain problems while creating others. The term itself further shapes interpretation. To label a society a civilization is to group it with a particular set of historical exemplars, most prominently those of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. This can obscure regional diversity. Civilizations in the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia developed under different ecological and cultural conditions, often following trajectories that do not align neatly with the so-called classic model. When similarities are found, they may reflect convergent solutions to shared challenges rather than diffusion from a single origin point. The investigation, therefore, is not only about the distant past but also about the lenses used to view it. Archaeology does not uncover raw history, it uncovers material traces that must be interpreted. Those interpretations are influenced by contemporary ideas about statehood, economy, and social order. Even the distinction between complex and simple societies is increasingly questioned. Hunter-gatherer groups once described as egalitarian and loosely organized are now understood to have maintained intricate social networks, symbolic systems, and long-distance exchanges. This raises a central tension. If social complexity, ritual life, and large-scale cooperation existed long before cities and writing, then the boundary separating civilization from what came before becomes blurred. Civilization may not mark the beginning of organized human society, but rather a particular configuration of it, one that leaves a distinctive archaeological signature. Whether that configuration deserves its elevated status is part of the ongoing debate. At the same time, abandoning the concept entirely poses its own difficulties. The term provides a shorthand for discussing large, stratified, urban societies with institutionalized authority. Without some form of categorization, comparative analysis becomes unwieldy. The question is not simply whether the word should be used, but how cautiously and with what awareness of its limitations. The investigation thus begins not with ruins or artifacts, but with language itself. A single word, widely accepted, quietly shapes narratives about origins, progress, and human potential. Before examining the first cities or the first scripts, it becomes necessary to examine the conceptual frame through which those developments are seen. What is at stake is not only the definition of civilization, but the broader story of how humanity understands its own past. Long before the first cities rose from river plains, before stone monuments or written records marked human presence on the landscape, the vast majority of our species' history unfolded in worlds without walls, streets, or states. For roughly 300,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived as foragers, moving through environments shaped by climate shifts, migrating herds, and seasonal cycles. This immense span of time is often treated as a prelude, a background to the real story that begins with agriculture and urban life. Yet growing archaeological evidence suggests that this so-called pre-civilized era was neither simple nor socially undeveloped. Early human groups operated within networks of cooperation that extended beyond immediate family units. Stone tools found hundreds of kilometers from their geological sources indicate exchange systems that connected distant communities. Such movement was not random. It implies roots, shared knowledge of landscapes, and social agreements governing access to resources. These patterns complicate older portrayals of small, isolated bands concerned only with immediate survival. Symbolic expression also appears deep in this period. Cave paintings in Europe, Indonesia, and elsewhere depict animals, abstract signs, and occasionally human figures, often in locations difficult to access. Their placement suggests intentionality beyond decoration. Pigments had to be sourced, prepared, and applied in environments requiring artificial light. The images themselves sometimes recur across sites, hinting at shared symbolic conventions. Whether interpreted as ritual, storytelling, or territorial markers, such works reflect systems of meaning transmitted across generations. Burial practices provide further evidence of social and cognitive complexity. In several regions, individuals were interred with objects such as tools, ornaments, or animal remains. The care invested in these burials indicates more than disposal of the dead. It suggests beliefs about personhood, memory, or an existence beyond death. These practices required collective participation and the allocation of time and labor that did not yield immediate material returns. Social organization within foraging societies is the subject of ongoing debate. Earlier models often emphasized egalitarian structures, proposing that mobility and limited material accumulation prevented the emergence of strong hierarchies. More recent research, however, reveals considerable variation. Some groups appear to have developed forms of leadership tied to ritual knowledge, hunting skill, or control over key resources. Seasonal aggregation sites, places where multiple groups gathered at certain times of year, may have fostered more complex political and ceremonial interactions than once assumed. The scale of cooperation is particularly striking. The survival of foragers depended on detailed ecological knowledge, migration patterns of animals, seasonal availability of plants, and subtle environmental cues. This knowledge was cumulative, built over generations and shared through teaching and oral tradition. Language, already fully developed in its cognitive foundations, would have served as the primary medium for transmitting such information. Although language leaves no direct archaeological trace, its inferred presence underlies the capacity for coordinated action on a significant scale. Technological sophistication in this era is also frequently underestimated. Stone tool industries show careful standardization and long-term continuity, reflecting teaching systems and shared technical norms. The production of composite tools, such as spears with stone tips hafted onto wooden shafts, required multiple materials and steps. In some regions, evidence of early watercraft and long-distance sea crossings suggests advanced planning and navigational ability. These features challenge the assumption that complexity is tied primarily to sedentary life. Mobility did not preclude organization, rather, it shaped it differently. Social ties often extended across landscapes rather than concentrating in permanent settlements. Exchange of marriage partners, ritual objects, and information maintained cohesion over wide areas. Some anthropologists describe these systems as networked societies, emphasizing flexibility rather than centralization. The end of the last ice age, beginning around 11,700 years ago, marks a major environmental transition. As glacier retreated and climate stabilized, new ecological niches opened. In several regions, human groups began to intensify their use of particular resources. Large camps appear, occupied repeatedly over long periods. Storage pits and grinding stones indicate efforts to process and preserve plant foods. These developments blur the line between foraging and farming, suggesting a gradual shift rather than a sudden revolution. It is within this context that the conventional narrative places the threshold of civilization. Yet the evidence from earlier periods forces reconsideration. If symbolic systems, long-distance exchange, specialized technologies, and structured social relations already existed, then the distinction between before and after becomes less absolute. The difference may lie not in the presence of complexity, but in its form, how people organized space, authority, and resources. Some researchers argue that the move toward agriculture and permanent settlement represented one possible pathway emerging from already intricate social worlds. Others emphasize environmental pressures, proposing that climatic fluctuations pushed communities toward cultivation and animal domestication. Both perspectives acknowledge that the foundations for large-scale cooperation were in place long before the first crops were sown. The portrayal of foragers as living on the edge of survival has also been reassessed. While conditions varied widely, ethnographic studies of recent foraging societies suggest that some groups maintained flexible schedules, diverse diets, and strong social safety nets. This has led to debates over whether the adoption of agriculture improved or constrained human well-being. Such discussions remain contested and must be framed carefully, given the fragmentary nature of the archaeological record. What becomes clear is that the deep human past cannot be reduced to a simple stage of cultural infancy. The people who lived in these eras navigated complex social landscapes, managed knowledge systems, and engaged in symbolic practices that anchored group identity. Their worlds lacked cities and writing, but they were not devoid of structure or meaning. As the investigation moves forward, the question persists: if the roots of organized social life reach so far back, what precisely changed when humans began to cultivate land and cluster in permanent settlements? The answer lies not only in new technologies, but in new ways of arranging relationships between people, resources, and power, transformations that would gradually reshape the human experience on a scale previously unseen. As the last ice age loosened its grip on the planet, the environments that had shaped human life for tens of thousands of years began to transform. Glacier retreated, coastlines shifted, and ecosystems reorganized. Forests expanded into former tundra. Grasslands altered their ranges. Animals followed changing habitats, and human groups adjusted with them. This period of climatic stabilization, beginning roughly 11,700 years ago, created conditions unlike those experienced by earlier generations. Within this new environmental framework, a profound reconfiguration of human subsistence began to unfold. The shift toward agriculture has often been described as a revolution, a decisive turning point that separated mobile foragers from settled farmers. Fields replaced wild landscapes. Villages replaced seasonal camps. Food production replaced food gathering. Yet archaeological evidence increasingly suggests a more gradual and regionally varied process. In several parts of the world, communities experimented with plant management long before full domestication occurred. Wild grains were harvested intensively. Certain plants were encouraged to grow near campsites. Human influence on local ecologies deepened step by step. In Southwest Asia, often cited as one of the earliest centers of agriculture, evidence from sites associated with the Natufian culture shows semi-sedentary communities living in stone-built structures before clear domestication of crops. Grinding stones, sickle blades, and storage facilities indicate reliance on wild cereals. These groups did not immediately abandon foraging, rather, they combined strategies. The boundary between hunter-gatherer and farmer appears less like a line and more like a broad zone of transition. The domestication of plants and animals introduced new relationships between humans and other species. Selective harvesting favored certain traits: larger seeds, non-shattering grain heads, more docile animals. Over generations, these pressures produced genetic changes in wheat, barley, rice, maize, goats, sheep, and other species. This coevolution altered ecosystems and human routines alike. Food could be stored, planned for, and, to some extent, controlled. The unpredictability of wild resources was partially replaced by the risks of crop failure and livestock disease. One of the most significant consequences of cultivation was the possibility of surplus. When production exceeded immediate needs, resources could be accumulated. Storage facilities appear in early farming settlements, suggesting foresight and communal organization. Surplus enabled some individuals to devote time to activities other than food acquisition, craft production, tool specialization, ritual roles. Whether this diversification led directly to social hierarchy is debated. Some scholars see surplus as the foundation of inequality, while others argue that communal norms could regulate distribution for extended periods. Permanent or semi-permanent settlements also altered social dynamics. Houses clustered together changed patterns of interaction, conflict resolution, and cooperation. Land, once traversed seasonally, became territory with enduring value. Questions of access, inheritance, and ownership likely gained new importance. Archaeological traces of boundary markers, house rebuilding over generations, and differential access to goods hint at evolving concepts of place and property. Population growth is another factor frequently associated with the agricultural transition. More reliable food sources could support larger communities, which in turn required more structured forms of coordination. However, cause and effect remain debated. Did population pressure drive groups to intensify food production, or did cultivation allow populations to expand? Evidence varies by region, and no single model fits all cases. The health consequences of early farming communities present a complex picture. Skeletal remains from some early agricultural sites show increased signs of nutritional stress, dental disease, and infectious illness compared to earlier forages. Dense settlements facilitated the spread of pathogens, especially those transmitted from domesticated animals. Diets based on a limited range of staple crops could lead to deficiencies. These findings complicate narratives that portray agriculture as an unambiguous improvement in human welfare. At the same time, the organizational demands of farming may have encouraged new forms of collective labor. Irrigation systems, field preparation, harvest coordination, and storage management required planning beyond the household level. Whether these activities were directed by emerging leaders, communal councils, or ritual authorities differs across contexts. What is clear is that agriculture tied people more closely to particular landscapes and to one another. Climate variability continued to influence these developments. Periods of drought or cooling, such as the Younger Dryas event, may have disrupted established subsistence strategies, prompting experimentation with cultivation. Environmental stress could have acted as a catalyst, but it did not dictate uniform outcomes. In some regions, communities intensified farming; in others, they maintained mixed economies or returned to greater mobility. The interpretation of this transition remains one of the central debates in the study of early societies. One perspective frames agriculture as the engine that drove the emergence of complex social structures, eventually leading to cities and states. Another proposes that increasing social complexity, ritual gatherings, exchange networks, and population aggregation, created conditions in which cultivation became advantageous or necessary. In this view, farming was not the origin of complexity but one expression of it. As settlements grew more permanent and food production more systematic, the material traces of human life began to accumulate in ways more visible to archaeology. Layers of construction, storage pits, tools, and waste created enduring records. These sites form the bridge between deep prehistory and the urban worlds that follow. The agricultural transition did not immediately produce civilization as traditionally defined, but it reconfigured the relationship between humans, resources, and space in lasting ways. The question that emerges from this stage of the investigation is not simply how people began to farm, but how these new subsistence strategies reshaped social possibilities. The seeds of future institutions, property, leadership roles, labor organization, may lie within these early experiments with cultivation. Yet the path from field to city was neither direct nor inevitable, and its trajectory varied across regions, leaving a complex pattern that resists a single explanatory model. By the 4th millennium BCE, in several regions of the world, human settlements reached a scale and density that marked a new stage in social organization. Clusters of dwellings expanded into continuous urban landscapes. Streets emerged, whether formally planned or gradually shaped by movement and construction. Specialized districts appeared, devoted to craft production, storage, or ritual activity. The city, as a durable concentration of population and function, entered the archaeological record. In southern Mesopotamia, the settlement of Uruk has often been presented as one of the earliest and clearest examples of this transformation. Excavations reveal large public buildings, monumental temple complexes, and evidence of administrative practices. Standardized clay tablets and seal impressions point to systems of accounting and control over goods. The scale of construction implies organized labor beyond the household. Yet even here, interpretation remains cautious. The precise nature of authority, whether centralized under a single ruler or distributed among institutions such as temples, continues to be debated. Along the Nile Valley, communities coalesced into increasingly complex polities that eventually formed a unified Egyptian state. Monumental architecture, including early temples and funerary structures, suggests coordinated labor and shared ideological frameworks. The Nile's predictable flooding created a distinct ecological context, supporting agriculture along a narrow corridor. Some scholars emphasize this environmental regularity as a factor in political centralization, while others point to long-standing regional interactions and emerging elite identities as equally significant. In the Indus Valley, large settlements such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa present a different pattern. Urban layouts show evidence of planning, grid-like streets, standardized brick sizes, and sophisticated drainage systems. Yet conspicuous signs of centralized kingship, palaces, large royal tombs, or overt depictions of rulers, are less evident than in Mesopotamia or Egypt. This absence has led to competing interpretations. Some researchers propose more collective or corporate forms of governance, while others caution that the symbols of authority may simply remain unrecognized or undiscovered. Early urban centers also emerged in northern China, where archaeological sites associated with the Erlitou culture display palatial compounds, bronze production, and indications of social stratification. These developments are sometimes linked to later dynastic traditions, though the continuity between archaeological cultures and historical accounts remains a matter of scholarly discussion. As elsewhere, metallurgy, ritual practice, and control over resources appear intertwined with evolving political structures. The appearance of cities across these regions raises a fundamental question. Do these cases represent variations of a single process, or independent responses to shared pressures? Urbanization occurred under different environmental conditions, with distinct crops, animals, and cultural histories. The similarities, population concentration, specialized labor, monumental building, suggest convergent solutions to challenges of coordination and resource management. At the same time, the differences caution against assuming a universal blueprint. Cities altered not only scale but also experience. Dense populations increased the frequency of interaction, cooperation, and conflict. Craft specialization intensified, with evidence of workshops dedicated to pottery, metalworking, textile production, and other trades. Exchange networks expanded, bringing raw materials from distant regions into urban centers. Such systems required mechanisms of organization, whether administrative offices, communal institutions, or elite households. Urban space itself became structured. Public areas, ritual precincts, residential zones, and industrial sectors formed a complex spatial order. The management of water, waste, and food supplies became critical concerns. Archaeological remains of canals, wells, drains, and storage facilities reflect ongoing efforts to sustain large populations in fixed locations. These infrastructures imply planning horizons extending beyond immediate needs. The growth of cities also intensified social differentiation. Variations in house size, burial goods, and access to luxury items suggest emerging hierarchies. Yet the degree and form of inequality differ among regions. In some cases, elite display is pronounced, in others, material differences appear more muted. Interpreting these patterns requires caution, as preservation conditions and excavation histories shape the available evidence. Urbanization did not necessarily replace earlier ways of life. Rural communities continued to exist alongside cities, supplying food and raw materials. Movement between urban and non-urban zones remained possible, though perhaps increasingly structured. The relationship between city and countryside became a defining feature of these societies, binding diverse populations into broader economic and political systems. The emergence of the first cities thus marks a visible turning point in the archaeological record, where many elements associated with civilization, administration, specialization, monumental architecture, converge. Yet even at this stage, the form and function of urban life vary widely. The city was not a single invention replicated everywhere, but a flexible solution shaped by local histories. Understanding how these early urban experiments operated, and how they structured power and daily life, remains central to the broader investigation into what civilization ultimately came to mean. As urban centers expanded and economic activities grew more intricate, new demands emerged for methods of tracking goods, labor, and obligations. In several early societies, systems of notation appeared that would later be recognized as writing. These systems did not arise as vehicles for literature or philosophical reflection. Their earliest traces point toward administration, marks impressed on clay, incised on bone, or painted on surfaces to record transactions, quantities, and identities. In southern Mesopotamia, small clay tokens had long been used to represent units of goods such as livestock or grain. Over time, these tokens were enclosed in clay envelopes, with impressions made on the exterior to indicate their contents. Eventually, the impressions themselves became sufficient, evolving into pictographic signs inscribed directly onto tablets. This shift reduced three-dimensional objects to two-dimensional marks, increasing efficiency and standardization. The process reflects gradual adaptation rather than sudden invention. These early scripts functioned within institutional settings. Temples, storehouses, and administrative centers appear to have been key sites of record keeping. Tablets list rations distributed to workers, inventories of materials, and allocations of land or livestock. Writing thus became embedded in the management of resources and labor. It extended memory beyond the limits of individual recollection, allowing obligations and transactions to be tracked across time and space. The connection between writing and authority is a central theme in scholarly interpretation. Control over records meant influence over economic flows. The ability to define categories, measure quantities, and formalize agreements provided tools for governance. Some researchers argue that writing enabled more centralized and hierarchical forms of political organization. Others caution that writing also facilitated coordination within complex but not necessarily autocratic systems. The relationship between literacy and power is therefore understood as significant but not uniform. Access to writing was likely restricted. Evidence from later periods indicates the presence of trained scribes who underwent specialized education. Although the earliest stages of writing leave fewer direct clues about training systems, the complexity of signs and conventions implies expertise. Literacy, in this context, was not widespread but concentrated among individuals linked to institutions. This concentration may have reinforced social distinctions, as written knowledge became a specialized resource. The appearance of writing in Egypt followed a somewhat parallel trajectory, though with distinctive features. Early hieroglyphic signs appear on ceremonial objects and labels, often associated with royal or elite contexts. These inscriptions combine administrative functions with symbolic display. Writing here seems tied not only to accounting but also to the projection of authority and identity. Names of rulers, depictions of ritual scenes, and formalized iconography link script with ideology. In the Indus Valley, numerous seals and short inscriptions suggest a system of symbols used across a wide geographic area. However, the script remains undeciphered, and its precise function is debated. Some scholars view it as a full writing system. Others propose it may represent a more limited set of signs used for identification or ritual purposes. The absence of long texts complicates interpretation, highlighting how much remains uncertain about early literacy outside regions with deciphered scripts. China's earliest writing, known from oracle bones of the late 2nd millennium BCE, appears in divinatory contexts. Questions posed to ancestral spirits were inscribed on bones or shells, then interpreted through cracks produced by heat. These records combine ritual practice with administrative record-keeping, as they often include dates, names, and outcomes. Writing here is intertwined with religious authority and political legitimacy, illustrating again the close association between script and institutional power. Despite these developments, not all complex societies adopted writing at the same time or in the same way. Some maintained elaborate political and economic systems with limited or no use of formal scripts. In parts of the Andes, for example, knotted cord devices known as quipu were used for accounting and communication without representing spoken language in a conventional script. Such cases challenge the assumption that writing, in a narrow sense, is a prerequisite for civilization. The presence of writing changes the nature of historical evidence. Once texts appear, scholars gain access to names, events, and categories defined by the societies themselves. Yet this apparent clarity introduces new biases. Written records often reflect the concerns of institutions and elites rather than the broader population. They preserve what authorities considered worth recording: taxes, offerings, decrees, while everyday experiences may remain invisible. Writing also alters temporal awareness. Records allow for the establishment of calendars, genealogies, and chronologies. They support the idea of continuity across generations and the formalization of tradition. In this sense, writing contributes not only to administration but to the construction of collective memory. How societies understood their past and projected their future became increasingly shaped by written forms. The investigation into writing thus moves beyond the question of invention to its consequences. Scripts emerged within particular social and economic contexts, responding to practical needs while reinforcing institutional structures. They expanded the capacity to organize complex systems, but they also concentrated knowledge and authority. Whether writing should be considered a defining feature of civilization remains debated, yet its role in shaping the mechanics of early states and cities is undeniable. As settlements expanded and institutions took shape, systems of belief became increasingly visible in the material record. Temples rose within cities. Ritual objects accumulated in dedicated spaces. Burials displayed signs of ceremony and differentiation. These traces suggest that religion was not a peripheral aspect of early societies, but interwoven with social organization, political authority, and daily life. Understanding early civilizations requires examining how sacred frameworks structured human relationships. In many early urban centers, monumental architecture appears closely tied to ritual activity. Large platforms, enclosed precincts, and elaborately constructed buildings often occupy central positions within settlements. In Mesopotamia, stepped temple complexes dominated city skylines. In Egypt, temples and mortuary structures were aligned with cosmological principles and royal ideology. These constructions demanded coordinated labor on a scale that exceeded household capacity, implying shared participation in projects framed as spiritually significant. Religious institutions also appear to have functioned as economic and administrative centers. Offerings of food, textiles, and animals are recorded in some early texts, while storage facilities associated with temples suggest management of resources. Priests or ritual specialists may have overseen these activities, though the exact boundaries between sacred and administrative roles are difficult to reconstruct. In several cases, the same institutions that mediated between humans and deities also mediated flows of goods and labor. Cosmology provided a framework for interpreting the world and justifying social arrangements. Myths concerning creation, order, and divine authority often place gods at the origin of laws, kingship, and moral codes. Rulers in some societies were portrayed as chosen by, descended from, or even embodiments of divine forces. Such claims linked political power with cosmic order, presenting hierarchy not merely as human arrangement but as reflection of a broader universal structure. The relationship between belief and authority is a focus of ongoing debate. One interpretation emphasizes integration. Shared rituals and narratives created cohesion among diverse urban populations, fostering cooperation and collective identity. Another highlights control. Religious symbolism may have legitimized unequal distributions of power and resources. These perspectives are not mutually exclusive. Belief systems could unite communities while simultaneously reinforcing stratification. Material culture offers glimpses into ritual practice beyond monumental architecture. Figurines, amulets, altars, and decorated vessels appear in domestic as well as public contexts. This distribution suggests that religious activity was not confined to formal institutions but embedded in household life. The boundary between private and public ritual may have been fluid, with practices ranging from local ancestor veneration to large-scale ceremonies involving entire communities. Burial practices provide another window into belief systems. Variations in grave goods, tomb construction, and body treatment indicate differing conceptions of status and the afterlife. In some regions, elaborate tombs for elites contrast sharply with simpler burials for others, reflecting social differentiation expressed through funerary ritual. Interpretations of these patterns must remain cautious, as material investment in burial does not translate directly into beliefs, but the scale and consistency of practices point to structured ideas about death and continuity. Astronomical alignments observed in certain monuments suggest attention to celestial cycles. The orientation of buildings toward solstices, equinoxes, or specific stars may reflect cosmological principles linking earthly order with the heavens. Whether such knowledge was widely shared or concentrated among specialists remains debated. In either case, observation of the sky appears to have informed calendars, agricultural timing, and ritual schedules. Religious authority did not necessarily operate in isolation from other forms of leadership. In some contexts, political and ritual roles may have been unified in a single office. In others, they could have been distributed among different groups. The precise configuration likely shifted over time. Archaeological remains rarely provide direct evidence of institutional structures, requiring interpretation through patterns of architecture, iconography, and associated artifacts. The study of early religion must also account for diversity and change. Belief systems were not static, they evolved as societies expanded, encountered neighbors, and reorganized internally. Deities could merge, rituals could transform, and new symbols could emerge. What appears in the record as a coherent religious tradition may represent a dynamic process shaped by historical contingencies. In examining belief as a structural force, the investigation moves beyond the question of personal faith. Religion in early civilizations helped define authority, coordinate labor, structure time, and embed social norms within a larger cosmological narrative. Whether understood primarily as shared meaning or as an instrument intertwined with power, sacred systems formed a central component of how these societies understood their place in the world and organized life within it. As early cities expanded and institutions solidified, the material record begins to reveal patterns that complicate the image of civilization as uniform advancement. Alongside monumental architecture and specialized craft production, there are signs of uneven living conditions, differential access to resources, and physical stress inscribed on human remains. These traces suggest that the benefits and burdens of urban life were not distributed equally. Variation in housing provides one line of evidence. In many early urban sites, residential structures differ markedly in size, construction quality, and associated goods. Some dwellings contain multiple rooms, storage facilities, and imported materials. Others are smaller, more densely clustered, and built with less durable materials. Such contrasts are often interpreted as indicators of social hierarchy. While caution is necessary, preservation bias and excavation focus can distort patterns. The consistency of differences across sites points to structured inequality. Burial practices further illuminate social differentiation. Certain graves include ornaments, weapons, or exotic items, while others contain few or no grave goods. Elaborate tomb architecture for a small segment of the population contrasts with simpler interments for the majority. These distinctions are commonly linked to status, lineage, or role within the community. However, interpretations remain debated, as funerary display may reflect ritual choices rather than direct measures of wealth or power. Evidence of labor intensity appears in both artifacts and skeletal remains. Large-scale construction projects, walls, temples, irrigation systems, required sustained, coordinated effort. The organization of such work is uncertain. Some scholars propose systems of corvée labor, where communities contributed periodic work to collective projects. Others suggest the presence of dependent labors or forms of servitude. Skeletal markers such as joint wear, spinal compression, and repetitive strain injuries indicate physically demanding activities performed over long periods. Health profiles from early agricultural and urban populations reveal additional costs. Compared with many earlier foraging groups, some early farming communities show reduced stature, higher rates of dental caries, and evidence of nutritional deficiencies. Reliance on a narrow range of staple crops may have limited dietary diversity. Dense living conditions facilitated the transmission of infectious diseases, including those originating from domesticated animals. These patterns vary by region and period, but they challenge narratives that equate urbanization with improved well-being. The concentration of resources in urban centers also created dependencies. Rural producers supplied food, raw materials, and labor to cities. Control over these flows could generate tensions, particularly in times of shortage. Archaeological signs of fortifications, weaponry, and destruction layers in some sites suggest episodes of conflict, though the scale and frequency of warfare remain subjects of debate. Internal unrest, competition among elites, and struggles over resources may have accompanied periods of growth. Specialization, often celebrated as a hallmark of civilization, had complex implications. Craftspeople, administrators, and ritual specialists could develop skills that enhanced status and influence. At the same time, specialization reduced self-sufficiency, tying individuals to broader systems of exchange and authority. The degree to which specialists could move between roles or were bound to particular institutions is difficult to determine, but economic interdependence increased. Gender and age likely shaped experiences within these societies, though evidence is indirect. Differences in burial goods, skeletal stress markers, and spatial organization of dwellings hint at divisions of labor and status along lines of sex and generation. Interpretations must remain cautious, as modern assumptions can influence analysis, yet it is clear that urban life structured opportunities and constraints differently for different groups. Debate persists over how to evaluate these patterns. One perspective views inequality in labor demands as structural features of complex societies, necessary for sustaining large populations and ambitious projects. Another questions whether such systems represented progress for most participants, emphasizing that earlier lifeways may have offered greater autonomy or dietary diversity. These discussions do not produce simple conclusions but highlight the trade-offs embedded in the shift toward urban civilization. The material record does not preserve voices, but it preserves bodies, buildings, and tools. Through them, a picture emerges of societies capable of remarkable coordination and creativity, yet marked by stratification and strain. Civilization, in this light, appears not as a uniform ascent but as a reorganization of human life that generated new possibilities alongside new vulnerabilities. Understanding these hidden costs is essential for assessing what early complex societies achieved and what they demanded in return. No civilization, however durable it may appear in its monumental remains, existed in a state of permanent stability. The same systems that enabled large populations, specialized production, and far-reaching exchange also created points of vulnerability. Archaeological records from multiple regions show episodes of contraction, transformation, or abandonment that mark the limits of complex social arrangements. These patterns shift the focus from origins to endurance. Environmental change is frequently identified as a contributing factor in periods of decline. Variations in rainfall, prolonged droughts, flooding, or shifts in river courses could disrupt agricultural production, the foundation of urban life. In regions dependent on irrigation, the maintenance of canals and water management systems required continuous labor and coordination. Salinization of soils, erosion, or sediment buildup could reduce yields over time. While environment alone rarely explains societal change, it forms part of the context within which decisions and stresses unfolded. Interconnected trade networks, a source of wealth and diversity, also introduced fragility. Urban centers often relied on materials from distant regions, metals, timber, stone, and luxury goods. When exchange routes were disrupted, through conflict, environmental barriers, or political fragmentation, local economies could be strained. Archaeological evidence of declining craft production, reduced access to imported materials, or changes in settlement patterns sometimes coincides with signs of broader regional disruption. Warfare and internal conflict present another dimension. Fortifications, weapon deposits, and destruction layers indicate episodes of violence in certain times and places. Competition among city-states, struggles over territory or resources, and shifts in political alliances could destabilize established systems. Yet the scale and nature of conflict vary widely, and interpretations must avoid assuming constant warfare as the default condition. Some collapses may have been relatively peaceful processes of dispersal or reorganization. Population dynamics also play a role in discussions of instability. Rapid growth can intensify pressure on land and resources, while decline may undermine labor systems and institutions. Disease, particularly in dense urban environments, could spread quickly. The archaeological record sometimes shows reductions in settlement size or the abandonment of urban centers, followed by the rise of smaller communities or new regional configurations. It is important to note that what is often termed collapse does not necessarily imply disappearance. Cultural practices, technologies, and social groups frequently persist, even when political structures change. In some cases, urban populations dispersed into rural areas. In others, new centers emerged elsewhere. The concept of collapse can oversimplify processes that were gradual, uneven, and experienced differently across social groups. Interpretations of these transformations are shaped by broader theoretical perspectives. One approach emphasizes systemic complexity. As societies grow more interconnected, they become more susceptible to cascading failures when one part of the system falters. Another focuses on human agency, highlighting decisions by leaders and communities in response to stress. These views are not mutually exclusive. Environmental pressures, economic networks, and political choices interact in ways that resist single-cause explanations. Archaeological sequences from Mesopotamia, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Indus region, and elsewhere show cycles of growth and contraction rather than a single rise and fall. Periods of urban florescence are followed by phases of decentralization, after which new configurations may emerge. Such patterns suggest that instability is not an anomaly but an inherent feature of complex societies operating over long timescales. The study of decline also challenges assumptions about linear progress. Technological and organizational achievements did not guarantee permanence. Monumental structures, once symbols of order and power, could become ruins within a few generations. This impermanence underscores the experimental nature of early large-scale social systems. They represented solutions to coordination and resource management, but solutions with limits. In tracing these episodes of instability, the investigation moves beyond the question of how civilizations began to how they endured and transformed under pressure. The evidence points toward fragility built into complexity, where the very mechanisms that enable expansion can, under certain conditions, contribute to contraction. These dynamics form part of the broader pattern that defines the historical trajectory of early civilizations, setting the stage for further examination of anomalies and alternative pathways in the story of human social organization. In the course of investigating early civilizations, certain archaeological discoveries resist easy placement within established models. These sites do not overturn existing frameworks, but they introduce complications that prompt reconsideration of how and when key features of complex society emerged. They function as anomalies not because they are inexplicable, but because they blur categories that once seemed stable. One of the most discussed examples is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia. Dated to the 10th millennium BCE, this site consists of large circular enclosures built from massive stone pillars, some carved with reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. The scale of construction implies coordinated labor and planning, yet the site predates clear evidence of agriculture in the region. This sequence challenges the assumption that farming was a necessary precondition for monumental architecture and organized ritual spaces. Interpretations of Göbekli Tepe vary. Some researchers view it primarily as a ritual center, used periodically by groups that were still largely mobile. Others suggest that gatherings at such sites may have fostered social networks that later supported the adoption of agriculture. The direction of causality, whether ritual aggregation encouraged cultivation or vice versa, remains debated. What is clear is that large-scale cooperation existed in forms not tied to permanent urban settlement. Other early sites display substantial architecture or symbolic complexity outside the traditional cradles of civilization. In parts of South America, monumental earthworks and ceremonial mounds appear in contexts where subsistence strategies do not align neatly with classic agricultural models. Similarly, in regions of sub-Saharan Africa and Oceania, evidence of long-distance exchange networks and elaborate ritual practices precedes the rise of large urban centers. These cases suggest that pathways to complexity were diverse. The existence of such sites raises methodological questions. Archaeological visibility is uneven across regions, influenced by research history, preservation conditions, and political factors. Some areas have been studied intensively for over a century, others remain underexplored. Apparent anomalies may partly reflect where attention has been focused. As new sites are uncovered, patterns once thought exceptional can become more familiar. Debate also centers on how to interpret monumentality itself. Large structures may signal centralized authority, collective ritual, or both. Without written records, determining the social mechanisms behind construction is challenging. Were workers mobilized through obligation, shared belief, seasonal gatherings, or other arrangements? Different models can fit the same material evidence, and interpretations often remain provisional. These anomalies encourage a shift away from strictly linear models of development. Rather than a single sequence moving from foraging to farming to cities and states, the record suggests experimentation with various forms of social organization. Some innovations persisted and expanded, others remained localized or temporary. Complexity appears as a mosaic of practices rather than a uniform package. The presence of early monumental or symbolic sites also complicates definitions of civilization tied too closely to urbanism. If large-scale ritual architecture, long-distance coordination, and symbolic systems existed before cities, then urbanization represents one configuration of complexity among several. This does not diminish the significance of cities, but it situates them within a broader spectrum of social forms. Scholars caution against using anomalies to construct alternative grand narratives without sufficient evidence. Extraordinary claims require careful evaluation of dating, context, and comparative data. The challenge is to integrate new findings into existing frameworks without forcing them into predetermined categories. This process often leads to revisions that are incremental rather than revolutionary. As the investigation continues, these sites serve as reminders that the archaeological record is incomplete and interpretations are evolving. They highlight the importance of flexibility in theoretical models and attentiveness to regional variation. Early human societies experimented with different ways of organizing cooperation, belief, and labor, leaving traces that do not always align with expectations shaped by later historical states. These discoveries do not provide final answers about the origins of civilization. Instead, they expand the range of possibilities that must be considered. By examining where evidence resists established patterns, the inquiry moves closer to understanding the diversity of pathways through which complex human societies have taken shape. As evidence from multiple regions accumulated, scholars sought broader frameworks to explain how complex societies formed and operated. These models aim to organize diverse archaeological findings into coherent patterns, yet they differ in emphasis, assumptions, and explanatory power. Chapter by chapter, the investigation has revealed variation and contradiction. Here, those observations converge in competing theories of what civilization represents. One influential model describes social development as a sequence of stages: small mobile bands, larger tribes, ranked chiefdoms, and finally states. In this view, increasing population density, economic intensification, and political centralization drive a gradual progression toward more stratified and bureaucratic systems. Early cities and states are seen as the culmination of processes already underway in earlier social forms. This framework offers clarity and comparative structure, but critics argue that it can oversimplify diversity and imply inevitability. An alternative approach emphasizes networks rather than hierarchies. Instead of a ladder of stages, this perspective envisions societies as webs of relationships, economic, ritual, and political, extending across regions. Power may be distributed among multiple centers rather than concentrated in a single authority. Exchange routes, marriage alliances, and shared symbolic systems can integrate large populations without uniform administrative control. Such models draw on evidence from societies where clear markers of centralized kingship are absent or ambiguous. The concept of heterarchy further complicates traditional hierarchies. In heterarchical systems, different forms of authority, ritual, economic, military, may overlap without a fixed ranking. A community could be led by ritual specialists in one context and by other figures in matters of trade or conflict. This framework helps interpret sites where monumental construction and coordination are evident, yet signs of rigid class stratification or centralized palaces are limited. It suggests that complexity does not always require a single dominant hierarchy. Environmental and economic models focus on material conditions. Some emphasize irrigation, arguing that large-scale water management required centralized coordination, which in turn fostered state formation. Others highlight trade, proposing that control over key resources and exchange routes generated wealth and political power. While these factors are undoubtedly important in some regions, they do not explain all cases. Complex societies emerged in environments with very different resource bases, indicating that no single material driver is sufficient. Ideological models stress the role of belief and shared meaning. Monumental architecture, ritual gatherings, and symbolic systems are seen as tools for integrating large groups and legitimizing authority. Leaders may have gained influence through control of ritual knowledge or access to sacred spaces. This perspective aligns with evidence from sites where religious institutions appear central. Yet separating ideological motivation from economic and political interests is often difficult, as these domains overlap. Some scholars advocate for viewing civilization as a spectrum rather than a category. Instead of asking whether a society is or is not a civilization, this approach examines degrees and combinations of complexity. Urbanization, writing, hierarchy, and specialization become variables that can appear in different configurations. This framework accommodates anomalies and regional diversity but can reduce clarity in comparative analysis. Underlying these models are differing assumptions about human behavior. Some emphasize competition, resource control, and coercion as drivers of complexity. Others highlight cooperation, collective action, and shared identity. Archaeological evidence supports elements of both. Large projects require coordination that may blend voluntary participation with obligation. Social systems can be both integrative and unequal. The multiplicity of models reflects not only the diversity of ancient societies but also the evolving nature of archaeological interpretation. New discoveries, improved dating methods, and interdisciplinary research continually reshape understanding. Theories are adjusted, combined, or replaced as evidence accumulates. Rather than converging on a single explanation, the field often moves toward more nuanced, context-sensitive interpretations. In bringing these perspectives together, the investigation underscores that civilization is not a single process with a universal formula. It is a concept used to describe recurring patterns of large-scale social organization, but those patterns arise through different pathways. Competing models do not simply contradict one another, they illuminate different aspects of complex societies. The challenge lies in determining which combinations of factors were most significant in particular contexts, while remaining aware that any model is a tool, useful, but limited in its capacity to capture the full variability of human history. After tracing definitions, origins, structures, and transformations, the investigation arrives at a landscape of partial answers and persistent uncertainties. The study of early civilizations has produced vast amounts of data, settlements mapped, artifacts catalogued, inscriptions translated, yet several foundational questions remain unsettled. These gaps are not signs of failure but reflections of the complexity of the subject and the limits of the available evidence. One enduring question concerns causation. What combination of factors most strongly drove the emergence of large, stratified, urban societies? Environmental change, population growth, technological innovation, trade expansion, and ideological developments have all been proposed as primary forces. In some regions, climatic stability appears to coincide with agricultural intensification. In others, social aggregation precedes clear environmental pressure. The variability suggests that no single cause operated universally, but the relative weight of different factors remains debated. Another unresolved issue is why complex societies arose independently in multiple parts of the world. Urban centers and state-level organizations developed in Southwest Asia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, among other areas, without direct contact in their early phases. Some scholars point to shared human cognitive capacities and similar responses to agricultural surplus and population density. Others emphasize region-specific histories and ecological conditions. The parallel emergence of complexity raises questions about common thresholds and convergent solutions. The role of individual agency versus structural forces also remains difficult to assess. Archaeology often highlights long-term patterns, settlement growth, trade networks, environmental trends, but the decisions of leaders, communities, and specialists shaped how societies responded to opportunities and stresses. Written records, where available, provide glimpses of named rulers and events, yet the balance between systemic pressures and human choices cannot be measured precisely. The nature of inequality in early civilizations continues to prompt debate. Material evidence demonstrates differences in wealth, status, and labor burdens, but the lived experiences behind these patterns are harder to reconstruct. Were hierarchies widely accepted as legitimate within prevailing belief systems, or were they sources of tension and resistance? Archaeology rarely captures dissent directly. Interpretations must infer social dynamics from indirect indicators such as fortifications, settlement shifts, or changes in material culture. Questions also surround the definition of civilization itself. As new sites blur distinctions between foragers, farmers, and urban dwellers, the usefulness of traditional criteria is reassessed. Some scholars advocate refining definitions, others suggest abandoning rigid categories in favor of more flexible descriptors of social complexity. The terminology chosen influences not only classification but also narratives about progress, decline, and human development. Chronology presents further challenges. Dating methods have improved, yet uncertainties remain, especially for early periods or regions with limited organic material for radiocarbon analysis. Small shifts in dates can alter perceived sequences of innovation and interaction. Determining whether developments were truly independent or influenced by contact depends in part on chronological precision. The interpretation of symbolic and ritual evidence introduces additional ambiguity. Monumental structures, iconography, and burial practices reveal that belief systems were central to early societies, but their meanings are not directly accessible. Scholars must balance comparative analysis with caution, avoiding projection of later religious concepts onto earlier contexts. The relationship between ideology and material conditions remains complex and often elusive. Finally, the broader narrative framework, whether civilization represents progress, adaptation, or a mix of gains and costs, remains open to interpretation. Archaeological data show increased coordination, technological achievements, and cultural production, alongside evidence of inequality, disease, and environmental strain. Evaluating these patterns involves not only empirical analysis but also philosophical perspectives on what constitutes improvement in human life. These unresolved questions ensure that the study of early civilizations remains an active field of inquiry rather than a completed story. Each discovery adds detail but also introduces new variables. The past does not present itself as a finished puzzle, it offers fragments that must be assembled into provisional models. As methods evolve and new regions are explored, interpretations will continue to shift, keeping the central questions in motion rather than closure. Across the span of this investigation, the term civilization has shifted from a seemingly fixed label to a complex and contested concept. The archaeological record reveals not a single moment of origin but a series of transformations in how humans organized space, labor, belief, and authority. Early cities, writing systems, monumental architecture, and administrative institutions did not emerge in isolation. They formed interdependent structures that reconfigured daily life on an unprecedented scale. Yet these developments appear less as a final destination than as one pathway among several in the long history of social experimentation. Civilization can be understood as an adaptive strategy. Dense settlements allowed for coordinated production, specialized knowledge, and the pooling of labor for large projects. Writing extended memory and facilitated administration. Religious and ideological systems integrated diverse populations under shared frameworks of meaning. These mechanisms enabled societies to manage resources, respond to environmental challenges, and sustain populations far larger than earlier mobile groups. In this sense, civilization represents a solution to the problem of large-scale cooperation. At the same time, the record demonstrates that these solutions carried inherent risks. Concentration of population increased vulnerability to disease and resource shortages. Dependence on agriculture tied communities to climatic stability and soil health. Hierarchical systems enabled coordination but also entrenched inequality. Long-distance trade enriched societies while exposing them to disruptions beyond local control. The structures that supported growth also created points of fragility, evident in recurring cycles of contraction and transformation. Recognizing civilization as both achievement and risk reframes it as an ongoing experiment rather than a completed stage. Early urban societies tested ways of organizing human life that balance cooperation with control, innovation with constraint. Some configurations proved resilient for centuries, others were short-lived. None achieved permanent stability. This pattern suggests that complexity is dynamic, continually renegotiated in response to internal and external pressures. The investigation also highlights the role of perception in shaping historical narratives. Modern observers often project contemporary values onto ancient developments, equating scale and monumentality with advancement. Yet the evidence encourages a more nuanced view. For many individuals, participation in early civilizations may have meant heavier labor, exposure to disease, and limited autonomy. For others, it offered opportunities for specialization, cultural expression, and expanded social networks. Civilization altered the range of possible experiences rather than uniformly improving or diminishing them. Connections between ancient and modern societies emerge in these structural patterns. Today's global systems, dense urban populations, specialized economies, complex administrations, and extensive trade networks, reflect principles established millennia ago. The same dynamics of interdependence and vulnerability remain visible. Environmental stress, resource management, inequality, and institutional adaptation continue to shape collective futures. The past does not provide direct prescriptions, but it offers long-term perspectives on recurring challenges. The study of early civilizations thus extends beyond antiquarian interest. It informs understanding of how large-scale human systems function, succeed, and falter. Archaeology, history, and related disciplines contribute data and models, but the picture remains incomplete. Each new discovery adjusts interpretations, reminding researchers that knowledge of the deep past is provisional. Civilization, viewed through this lens, is neither a singular achievement nor a simple measure of progress. It is a pattern of organization that humans have repeatedly constructed, modified, and sometimes abandoned. Its defining features, urban life, institutional authority, symbolic systems, economic specialization, are tools that can be combined in different ways. Their outcomes depend on context, choices, and circumstances. As the inquiry reaches this point, the concept at its center remains open-ended. Rather than a fixed definition, civilization appears as a field of possibilities shaped by human creativity and constraint. The structures first assembled in ancient river valleys and early urban centers continue to influence how societies imagine order, identity, and collective purpose. The investigation does not close the question of what civilization is, it situates that question within a long continuum of human efforts to organize life at scale, a process that continues to unfold.